is now head of the Commonwealth because the Queen really leaned on other Commonwealth nations to allow him to succeed her. The chances of Prince William succeeding him are quite slim if he doesn't do something about how Britain is understood and its role within the Commonwealth of Nations, which by extension is within its role of the empire.
Look, towards the end of her life, the Queen was determined that Charles should succeed her as Commonwealth head. What's the future for that club under the new king, do you think?
Yeah, great question. She was obsessed with the Commonwealth during her lifetime, and now, it hangs in the balance with King Charles III. There's a groundswell of demands for countries leaving the Commonwealth realm immediately. Antigua and Barbuda have both said that have said that they are going to have a referendum. The same in Jamaica. We're seeing calls for this in Australia and Canada. And I think that the king has an opportunity now to lead from the front. There are all kinds of issues that are percolating, from wanting to go it alone to having sort of a kind of colonial reckoning for British violence in the past, and he's going to have to face this head on.
And what do you think what was it that Queen Elizabeth II managed to do that held the Commonwealth together? Was it simple longevity? Was it that she was just such a symbol for people, or was it, perceived personal attributes?
I think it was a combination of all of those. Yeah, I think she was, remember, she came from a tradition. She inherited a monarchy that was quite intentional about wrapping itself in the empire. Much of its soft power came from not just, sort of overseeing the United Kingdom, but it came from sort of projecting itself as in her case, the matriarch of hundreds of millions of people around the world. And so when she inherited that throne in 1952, she was still overseeing the largest empire the world has known at that time. And so, in that sense, her ability to connect both in person, beckoning people to revere her, while at the same time, able to obscure the lived realities for many of those in the empire, was quite a feat. And it's really something Charles, quite frankly, is not going to be able to pull off.
So, that combination of holding things together while perhaps obscuring the dark is fascinating. Has been much discussed this week, albeit perhaps not quite so much in this country. But according to one of her biographers, Ben Pimlott, in 1979, the Queen, she had a significant role in bringing together our Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and various Southern African leaders, helping to pave the way for Rhodesia becoming Zimbabwe. So, there is a perception here often that she wasn't a monarch necessarily who was sort of clinging on to being head of state around the Commonwealth. She was, she was sort of understanding of countries developing in different ways. Is that incorrect, do you think?
I think it's an and both, right? I think she could be, and the Commonwealth itself can be capacious in sort of keeping the, if you will, to continue with the metaphor, the family under a large umbrella. And so even if we go back to India, which was the first, in 1949, it decides it wants to become a republic, no longer a realm, and the Commonwealth is able to sort of shift its rules such that that many of its members can simply recognize the crown as a symbol of free association, as opposed to pledging allegiance to the British crown, which is what the Commonwealth realms do. So to suggest that there's no dynamism within this would be absolutely wrong. But to miss the major point that the Queen really projected hers and Britain's continued global influence through the Commonwealth, which quite frankly doesn't really have much power when we think about it, is something we can't miss in this conversation.
Yeah, no, understood. The difference between being a member of the Commonwealth and having the British monarch as the head of state is something we should examine. So earlier this year, King Charles, although he of course wasn't King Charles at the time, said it was up to each Commonwealth member to decide whether to keep the monarch as head of state. And he said that arrangements such as these can change calmly and without rancour. Is having the monarch as head of state a big deal for the British monarch if the Commonwealth remains strong anyway?
Well, look, it seems to be. The Queen visited Canada 22 times during her reign. That's right?
Yep.
It seems to be, if we look at the royal tour, which was like a bunch of poor canaries into the coal mine in what is now Prince William and the Prince and Princess of Wales sent on a Caribbean tour to flag wave when they were really, sort of had the Commonwealth realm concept handed right back to them. In Belize, there was protest, Jamaica quite strong. So look, I think that Charles can say all he wants, but the question becomes, really at the heart of this, will he continue to gatekeep a kind of mythological British imperial past, or will he open that door, recognizing not just the ways in which the monarchy profited and benefited for generations prior to his mother's reign, but really also what happened on her imperial watch. And I think what's important to bear in mind is, what the Queen actually knew is very ambiguous, but it is up to, we are now looking forward, and it's up to Charles to really bring this monarchy into the 21st century when it comes to the Commonwealth.
I mean, in that respect, I guess he's got to. I mean, the challenge of what he's got to do then there is embracing that kind of thing that might be expected to be embraced in former outposts of the empire who are calling for atonement and reparations and stuff like that, while also basically not seeming to be betraying what many British people regard to be the legacy, if not the legacy of empire, then certainly the legacy of the Commonwealth, which is something much more consensual and friendly.
Yeah, on this issue, I wouldn't want to be Charles. Let's put it that way, right?
Right.
I would not want his role. And in some ways, he has to play, as we say in cards, the hand that was dealt to him,
Mm.
and it's a difficult one. And I think in this sense, being a defensive card player, to continue with the analogy, is not going to help him. I think he needs to look at what's going on and say, there is a groundswell, which has started sort of as a sort of a pushback against the official narrative. Now it's really a global groundswell, certainly in the former empire. And even if we look at home in terms of the degree of difference of how people remember Britain's imperial past. So I think in some ways, one thing that he can be doing at a minimum is to recognize this wide spectrum of understanding, and how do we start getting at informing the public of sort of what actually happened here. And in his case, making amends. There's nothing like making amends to help an entire generation move forward.
Do you think that would help the Commonwealth, though? I mean, because if his approach was to be to recognise calls for atonement and reparations, and to more generally be apologetic, we'll come on to that in a minute. Would that? I mean, does that help the Commonwealth, or does that undermine the Commonwealth?
Yeah, I think it depends on, help for whom, right? If the monarchy, which I think it does, wants to maintain a role within the British Commonwealth, because it is, let's not forget, it's not hereditary. He is now head of the Commonwealth because the Queen really leaned on other Commonwealth nations to allow him to succeed her. The chances of Prince William succeeding him are quite slim if he doesn't do something about how Britain is understood and its role within the Commonwealth of Nations, which by extension is within its role of the empire, because the Commonwealth of Nations is really the perfect, if you will, coda for a continued sense of British imperial benevolence, as the follow-up, the successor to the British Empire.
Yeah, understood. So look, if there are to be calls for apologies, even for reparations over the legacies of colonialism and slavery, where will they come from most strongly in when we look at Commonwealth nations, would you say?
Yeah, I think first of all, we have already seen there are nations within the Caribbean who are subject to British colonial rule, as well as other European rule, who have come together with sort of a 10-point plan of ways forward with this. And as you just gestured to, the first is an apology. They very much want that apology, and then the question becomes, addressing the particularly the economic imbalances that have taken place in these parts of the world. And, one often uses the example to move ourselves around the empire of Bangladesh today, one of the poorest nations in the world. In the 18th century, East Bengal was one of the wealthiest. What happens in between is British colonial rule. Similarly, if we look at Jamaica, its entire population was brought over by, in shackles beneath slave ships. And so what these nations are saying today is, look, you have to help us address some of our big picture issues of the systemic legacies of British colonialism, including healthcare, including education. So it's not just about writing a check, it's about apologizing and then accounting for some of the ways in which the kinds of economic and by extension political deprivations that have happened are addressed.
So, I mean, Prince Charles, I think when he was in Barbados, he condemned the appalling atrocity of slavery, and he praised islanders for forging their new path with extraordinary fortitude. And in Jamaica, Prince William called slavery abhorrent, but he stopped short of apologising. I mean, is it your view that in order to sort of maintain this Commonwealth legacy, this Commonwealth influence, people like Charles and William that are going to have to go a lot further?
They're going to. And look, I think you raised an important point, and because you're touching on one specific word, which is an apology, and that triggers all kinds of legal liability. And so I think that, I mean, those are carefully crafted statements. And I think that the king is going to have to step up and say, look, whatever legal liability may or may not occur, hundreds of millions of people are looking to me to apologize. And I'm going to need to do that. We're going to need to figure a way around this. And I think that's really, as one looks at this strictly through a legal lens, I think that is certainly one of the holdups. It's not the only one. As we know, if we go back to the Queen, nobody really knows what she thought. One of the most public figures in the world, and yet we know very little about what was going on in her mind. King Charles III has been much more outspoken in different ways. Whether or not that will change now that he is monarch, it's anybody's guess. But he is going to have to, getting back to your point, he is going to have to offer up a genuine apology.
Yeah.